What if everything we've been told about human civilization is incomplete? What if buried beneath the Iraqi desert pressed into clay, tablets over 5,000 years ago, lies evidence of a world that existed before our recorded history even begins? Tonight, we're stepping into a mystery that's kept archaeologists up at night for over 100 years. It's the kind of thing that just doesn't fit into the tidy history lessons we all remember from school. We're talking about the Sumerian texts, the oldest written records we've ever found. These ancient tablets talk about a time before the flood, a lost era when, if you believe them, the Anunnaki actually walked the earth. Before we get started, I'd love for you to hit like and subscribe. This channel is all about the Anunnaki, the Sumerians, and those deep, winding stories that history almost forgot. I make these long, calm documentaries for you to put on at night. No jump cuts, no loud noises, just ancient mysteries to help you drift off. If you're looking for something to keep you company as you fall asleep, you're in the right place. And hey, tell me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I always get a kick out of seeing viewers from all over the world, everyone up late, curious about the same old questions. Maybe it's 2 a.m. in Texas and you can't sleep. Maybe you're somewhere in Oregon, wide awake. Wherever you are, you're welcome here. So go ahead, dim the lights, maybe turn on a little white noise, get cozy. Tonight, we're traveling way back to an age before anyone separated myth from history. Back to a world the Sumerians said was nothing like the one that came after. A world that ended, not with a whimper, but with water. The story begins not with ancient myths, but with a very modern discovery in a very old place. The tablets that shouldn't exist. It's 1849. Picture Austin Henry Layard, a British adventurer with a knack for finding lost worlds, standing in the middle of Nineveh's ruins, northern Iraq these days. The sun's brutal. Dust hangs in the air. All around him, just heaps of earth and broken stones. What's left of an empire that vanished more than 2,000 years ago. But Layard onto something. He suspects there's treasure under these useless-looking hills. The library of Ashurbanipal, the last great Assyrian king. Now imagine the moment his workers hit something unexpected. Not another boring rock or some pottery shards, no, they opened chamber after chamber packed with clay tablets. We're talking tens of thousands, each one pressed with tiny wedge-shaped marks that had hardened in the oven centuries ago. Sure, a lot of these are everyday stuff, tax records, shipments, the usual, but some are stories, epic tales. Records of the stars, medical guides, and, most intriguing, accounts of things that happened before the flood. Layard can't read a word of it. Nobody in Europe can, not yet. That'll come later with scholars like Rawlinson and Smith. Still, Layard knows he's holding something huge. Imagine yourself there for a second. The sun's roasting your back, dust everywhere. You pick up a clay tablet, it's heavier than you'd think, solid and dense. Its surface is lined with those neat, sharp-edged marks, each one cut by a reed stylus, still crisp after thousands of years. This isn't paper that falls apart. It's not wood that worms eat. This is clay, baked hard as stone, outlasting empires, outlasting languages. On it, a story somebody thought mattered enough to save forever. Fast forward a few decades. Scholars finally break the cuneiform code in the mid-1800s, and what they find is wild. These tablets aren't just recent records, they're copies of texts from much older times, Sumerian times from far to the south, written more than 1,000 years before Ashurbanipal's day. And these older texts talk about things that shouldn't even be possible. They describe a time before history, before anyone counted years the way we do. They call it before the flood, a disaster so huge it splits time in two. Everything before, different. Everything after, smaller, faded. One of the strangest finds is the Sumerian king list. Copies have turned up all over. They all tell pretty much the same story, with a few tweaks here and there, and the details still bother historians. The list starts bluntly. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Not when people invented government, not when leadership just evolved. No, kingship just drops down from the sky like a gift. And that's just the start. The list rattles off 8 kings ruling 5 cities before the flood. Their reigns, off the charts. Alulim, first king, 28,800 years. Alagar, 36,000 years. Enman-Luana, 43,200 years. Altogether, the 8 kings rule for 241,200 years. Modern scholars try to explain it away. Maybe these are symbolic numbers. Maybe it's a translation mix-up, months, not years. Maybe the numbers stand for dynasties, not real people. Or maybe it's just myth exaggerating the past. But here's the weird part. The Sumerians were obsessed with accuracy. They tracked grain to the last bushel, measured fields to the meter, watched the stars with precision no one would match for ages. These folks didn't mess around with numbers. And the king list. It lists those wild reigns as casually as anything else. No epic language, no grand myth-making, just names, cities, numbers, like they're jotting it down in a ledger. Then comes the line, then the flood swept over. After that, everything shifts. The post-flood kings still reign for centuries, 200 years, 960 years, but the numbers keep dropping. Generation by generation, the spans shrink. By the time Gilgamesh shows up, a king we know actually lived, the reigns are down to decades. Normal human lifespans. It's as if the list is tracking something fatting, some quality that made those early rulers fundamentally different from the kings who came later, something that diluted over time until it disappeared entirely. What were they actually recording? American archaeologist Samuel Noah Kramer, who spent his career at the University of Pennsylvania translating Sumerian texts, called this history's first sudden civilization. The Sumerians appeared in southern Mesopotamia around 3500 BCE with no clear precursors. They already had writing. They already had complex mathematics. They already had sophisticated astronomy and urban planning. It wasn't that they developed these things in Sumer. It was as if they arrived with them already established, like someone had given them an instruction manual for civilization. But who or what? The Sumerian texts have an answer, and it's one that makes modern scholars deeply uncomfortable. They say the knowledge came from the Anunnaki beings they describe not as distant, abstract gods, but as physical entities who walked among humans, who taught them, who ruled them, who made decisions about humanity's fate with the casual authority of administrators managing a colony. The word Anunnaki itself is revealing. In Sumerian, it means something like those of princely blood, or those who from heaven came. Texts treat them as a specific group within the larger pantheon of gods, powerful but not the original creators of everything. They were children of the primordial gods, members of a divine council, judges who determined fates. But before the flood, according to these texts, their relationship with humanity was different, more direct, more intimate, more administrative. Wait though, before we go further into what the tablets say about these beings, we need to understand something crucial about how we even know what we know. These aren't original Sumerian tablets from 3500 BCE. Those don't survive. What we have are copies of copies made by scribes working for Assyrian kings like Ashurbanipal in the 7th century BCE. That's a gap of nearly 3,000 years between the events described and the earliest complete versions we possess. Think about that. The events described in the before the flood sections of Sumerian texts were as ancient to Ashurbanipal as Ashurbanipal is to us. These Assyrian scribes were copying texts that were to them what Roman writings are to us ancient, mysterious from a world so different it might as well be alien. And yet they copied them carefully. They noted when their source tablets were damaged. They marked places where the text was unclear. They added comments. This is copied from an ancient tablet, or the original was broken here. They treated these texts as something precious, something that had to be preserved exactly, even when they probably didn't fully understand what they were reading anymore, even when the Sumerian language itself was dead, kept alive only by scribes who learned it as a specialized scholarly language, the way Catholic monks learned Latin. Why go to such extraordinary effort to preserve these particular stories? What made them so important? In 1872, a British museum assistant named George Smith was cataloging tablets from Nineveh when he came across something that would make international headlines. He'd found a version of the flood story in. It was older than the biblical account in Genesis by at least 1,000 years. The tablet tells the story of a man named Utnapishtim. At least, that's what he's called in the Babylonian version. Earlier Sumerian texts call him Ziusudra. Either way, he's the guy who gets a warning from the god E or Enki if you're reading Sumerian about a flood that's about to wipe out humanity. E lays out the plan. Build a huge boat, seal it up with bitumen, pack it with animals and seeds, and wait out the disaster. The similarities to the story of Noah's Ark are impossible to miss. But here's the thing, this Mesopotamian flood story is much older, like ancient. When George Smith found this story, people went wild. The Times of London ran the story. Even the British Prime Minister sent his congratulations. The Daily Telegraph actually paid for Smith to head back to Nineveh, hoping he'd dig up more tablets and maybe find the rest of the tale. But in all the excitement over discovering an earlier version of Noah's flood, people miss something important. The Mesopotamian flood story isn't really about right and wrong or divine punishment. It's about something completely different. The gods don't decide to flood the world because humans are evil. They do it because people are just too loud. Seriously too noisy. The Atrahasis epic, another ancient flood story, spells it out. Humans multiply, their cities spread, and the whole world buzzes with activity and noise. Enlil, one of the main gods, can't sleep. The racket drives him nuts, so he talks the other gods into wiping out humanity just to get some peace and quiet. Not because people sinned, but because civilization got too rowdy. That's a totally different way of thinking about the flood. The gods, or the Anunnaki, depending on the version, don't see humanity as wicked. They see us as a problem to manage, or maybe just an annoyance that's gotten out of control. But there's one holdout. E, the crafty god of wisdom and water, thinks people deserve another shot. He can't justify the other gods outright. That would break the rules of the divine council. But he finds a loophole. He talks to a reed wall in Utnapishtim's house, making sure Utnapishtim is on the other side, listening in. Reed wall, listen to me, he says, and Utnapishtim overhears everything. He hasn't technically broken his oath not to warn a human directly. He's just worked around it. Think about what that means. These gods aren't all-powerful beings who do whatever they want. They have rules. They hold councils, follow procedures, and sometimes find ways to bend the rules without actually breaking them. In these stories, the Anunnaki don't come off as pure cosmic forces. They're more like officials. They argue, take votes, and sometimes regret their own decisions. He disagrees with the plan and does what he can to save humanity, even if it means slipping through a loophole. Then the flood hits. For 7 days and nights, water covers everything. Even the gods are shocked by what they've done. Ishtar, or Inanna, breaks down and cries, "How could I order the destruction of my people?" Suddenly, the gods have regrets. Genocide, even when it's decreed by the gods, turns out to be too much. When the waters finally recede, Utnapishtim steps off his boat and offers a sacrifice. The gods, hungry and desperate, swarm around it like flies. They need people. Without humans to care for temples and make offerings, the gods themselves are left wanting. So they strike a deal. Humanity gets to survive, but there's a catch. From now on, people will have shorter lives, less fertility, more disease, wild animals picking off the weak. All of it designed to keep the population down, so the gods never have to deal with the noise again. But let's pause for a second and look at what we're really reading. These are some of humanity's oldest written stories. They don't talk about the world's creation from scratch. They focus on what happened after a disaster. They remember a time before the flood, when lifespans were longer, when gods walked among people, when everything seemed new and strange and amazing. Even the Sumerians felt nostalgic. They looked back at an age lost to them. So where does that leave us? How much of this is just myth, and how much is a memory of something real? The antediluvian kings, rulers of a lost world. Let's get to know these 8 antediluvian kings. If you want to see the world the way the Sumerians did before the flood, you have to start with the people they said actually ruled it, and figure out what set those kings apart from everyone who came after. First up is Alulim. He ruled in Eridu for an unbelievable 28,800 years. His name stands out because, honestly, nobody really knows what it means in Sumerian. That's a big deal. Scholars take it as a sign of just how ancient he's supposed to be. Maybe his name comes from a time before the Sumerian language even existed, or maybe it's borrowed from some language even older. And Eridu wasn't just any city. We'll dig into this more later, but the Sumerians saw Eridu as the very first city, the birthplace of civilization itself. It's where the god Enki first met humanity and taught them how to live together in settled communities. If Alulim was the first king of the first city, then in Sumerian eyes, he's where organized society begins. Before him, chaos, wandering, people living more like animals than anything else. After he shows up, order, structure, and the start of everything the Sumerians would build. Now about that number, 28,800 years. It sounds random, but it's not. The Sumerians counted in base 60. In their system, 28,800 is 8 times 3,600. The number 3,600 pops up all over Mesopotamian texts as a sar, a sort of cosmic cycle or building block of time. So Alulim's reign is 8 sars. Next comes Alagar, who also ruled from Eridu, but for 36,000 years, exactly 10 sars. Again, that 3,600 is the backbone of their math. The Sumerians weren't just picking huge numbers out of thin air. They had a system, and these numbers meant something, even if we don't really get it now. Then there's Enmenluana, the third king, who adds something new. His name actually means something in Sumerian, the lord whose kingship was exalted. He didn't rule from Eridu, though. His seat of power was Bad-Tabira, which translates to Fortress of the Metal Workers, or Wall of the Copper Smiths. That matters. Bad-Tabira was famous for metallurgy, the shift from stone to copper and bronze. The king whose name literally celebrates kingship rules from the city known for metalwork. There's a clear link between political power and new technology here. The texts don't hide it. Enmenluana ruled for 43,200 years, 12 sars. After him, Enmengalana took over, still in Bad-Tabira, and ruled for another 28,800 years, 8 sars. So the third and fourth kings both ruled from the city of metal. Now the sixth king is Dumuzi, and he's in a league of his own. He isn't just a name on the king list. He becomes a major character in Mesopotamian mythology. Dumuzi, or Tammuz later on, is the shepherd god, Inanna's lover, the dying and rising figure who stands for the agricultural cycle. But in the king list, he's just the sixth pre-flood king, ruling Bad-Tabira for 36,000 years. They call him the shepherd. That might sound humble to us, but in Mesopotamia, shepherd was the classic way to describe a good king, someone who looks after his people the way a shepherd does his flock. It's telling that a figure who becomes so important in religion also gets listed as a historical king from before the flood. For the Sumerians, myth and history weren't two separate worlds. Dumuzi was a god, sure, but he was also a king, someone who lived and ruled in those ancient days. Next, the seventh king, Insipsiana, who ruled from Larak. His name means something like the Lord of the Bright Crown, or the Lord whose crown is pure. Another reign of 28,800 years, 8 SARS again. Larak doesn't show up much in later Sumerian stories. We don't know a lot about it, but some think it was tied to healing or purification rituals, maybe even a medical or religious center before the flood. Finally, there's Ubaratudu, the 8th antediluvian king. He ruled from Shuruppak for 18,600 years. That number's a bit different, not a neat multiple of 3,600. Some versions of the king list give different numbers for his reign, so it looks like the tradition got a little muddled here. That's the lineup. 8 kings, each with their own city, crazy long reigns, and stories that blur the line between myth, math, and memory. But Ubaratudu is crucial because he's explicitly identified as the father of Ziusudra, the flood hero, the Sumerian Noah, the 8th antediluvian king's son, is the man who will survive the catastrophe and become the bridge between the old world and the new. Shuruppak, where Ubaratudu ruled, has been excavated by archaeologists. It's a real place located in southern Iraq, and interestingly, excavations there revealed a thick layer of flood deposits dated to around 2900 BCE, interrupting the normal occupation sequence. The city was temporarily abandoned after a major flood, then reoccupied. Now that's far too recent to be the Great Flood that ended the antediluvian age in the king list, but it shows that Shuruppak really did experience catastrophic flooding in its history. The Sumerians who compiled the king list chose Shuruppak, a city with documented flood history, as the last antediluvian capital, the place where the old world ended and the new world began. These 8 kings, ruling from 5 cities, presided over the Golden Age. Before catastrophe, together they ruled for 241,200 years, 67 SARS. And then the flood swept over, and everything changed. After the flood, the king list says, kingship was lowered from heaven. Again, as if it had been withdrawn during the catastrophe and had to be reinstated. The first post-flood dynasty was at Kish, in North Mesopotamia, suggesting that survivors fled north to higher ground when the waters rose. The first king after the flood, Gower of Kish, ruled for 1,200 years. Still impossibly long by our standards, but a tiny fraction of Alulim's 28,800 years. The second post-flood king ruled for 960 years. The third for 840 years. Generation by generation, reign by reign, the numbers decrease. By the time we get to the first dynasty of Uruk, the dynasty that included the famous king Gilgamesh, we're down to reigns of 100-300 years. Still superhuman, but approaching the kinds of exaggerated lifespans we find in other ancient texts like the biblical patriarchs. And by 2500 BCE, when we start to have archaeological and textual evidence that can be verified independently, the reign lengths match normal human lifespans, kings ruling for 20, 30, 40 years. The age of the extraordinarily long-lived rulers has completely ended. What was happening? What were the Sumerians tracking with these decreasing numbers? Most modern scholars say these numbers are just symbols, myth, not history. The long lifespans stand in for whole ages or eras, not actual years. And as the numbers shrink, it's just a literary trick, a way to ease from mythic time into the more believable timeline of real kings and cities. But there's another way to look at it. What if the Sumerians meant something real? Maybe they weren't recording literal lifespans, but tracking some quality that faded over time. Think about the old stories, the antediluvian kings so closely tied to the Anunnaki. Some say they were even part Anunnaki themselves, children of gods and humans. If that's true, maybe those crazy long reigns mark their divine blood. The closer to the source, the longer you lived. After the flood, everything changes. The Anunnaki step back, divine-human unions become rare, and with each generation the bloodline thins out. Less Anunnaki, less of whatever let those old rulers live so long. The pattern makes sense. The numbers drop as the divine ancestry waters down. By the time you get to the kings we can actually prove existed, the magic is gone. Human kings, human lives. The age of demigods ends. Honestly, this idea, tracking genetic dilution over generations, lines up with the numbers on the king list better than most theories. It's not just a Sumerian thing either. All over the ancient world, people told similar stories. There was always a first age when gods and humans mixed, and their children stood out, stronger, longer lived, destined for greatness. Then over time, that spark faded. Look at the Greeks. Achilles, Heracles, Perseus, demigods, all of them. The Hindu epics are full of semi-divine heroes. Even the Bible has the Nephilim, born of sons of God and daughters of men. So maybe the Sumerian king list, with its shrinking numbers, is tracking the same thing, the slow loss of divine blood, the closing of the gap between gods and humans, the end of an age when the world felt bigger, stranger, more possible. At the very start of the list, you find the 8 antediluvian kings. They ruled a world we can barely picture, a place where the Anunnaki still walked the earth, where everything was new and civilization was just beginning. These weren't just names on some old list. To the Sumerians, they were the founders, the bridge between the divine and the mortal. Their impossible reigns marked them as something other than human. Then the flood came and swept it all away. The texts are clear. Whatever was lost then, we never got it back. Afterward, lifespans shrank, the gods grew distant, and life got harder. The golden age was over. But the memory stuck. People pressed it into clay, copied it again and again for thousands of years. That's how we know the names. Ululim, Alagar, Dumuzi, Ubaratudu. And even now, reading about them, you can't help but wonder what kind of world they really ruled, and if there's any truth hidden in those impossible numbers. When gods walked the earth. Let's talk about Eridu for a minute. If you've never heard the name before, you're not alone. Eridu isn't one of those blockbuster ancient cities. No mind-blowing pyramids, no epic sculptures, nothing that screams tourist attraction. Just a quiet mound of earth, sitting in the southern Iraqi desert about 20 kilometers from Nasiriyah. Kind of easy to overlook. But to the Sumerians, Eridu wasn't just another settlement. This was the city, the first city if you go by their own stories. According to them, this was where it all began. Civilization itself kicked off right here. Before the flood, they wrote, kingship was lowered from heaven and kingship was in Eridu. Back in the 1940s and 50s, when Iraqi and American archaeologists started digging into Eridu, they stumbled onto something wild. Under the most recent temple, they found an older one. And under that, another, and another. 18 in total, stacked up like a giant archaeological layer cake, stretching all the way back to about 5400 BCE. That's about 7,400 years ago, 2,000 years older than the Egyptian pyramids, even before Stonehenge, one of the oldest religious sites anyone's ever found. Here's the weird part. The earliest Temple I, right at the bottom, wasn't just some basic mud hut. It was already pretty advanced. There was a central sanctuary, an offering table, even specific proportions and orientations. Someone had a plan. From the very start, it was like the builders were following a blueprint, not just making things up as they went along. And the Sumerians kept coming back for over 3 millennia. They built and rebuilt the temple in exactly the same spot, sticking to the same design, the same sacred geometry every single time. Almost like they were restoring something that had always been there, instead of inventing something new. The god who watched over Eridu was Enki. His name literally means Lord of the Earth. The old texts call him the god of wisdom, fresh water, magic, and technology. Enki's temple was called Iabzu, House of the Cosmic Deep, and Sumerians believed it sat directly over the Abzu, the underground primordial ocean that fed every spring and river. Sounds like pure myth, right? But think about it. These people lived in Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers. They knew water like nobody else. Dig down anywhere in those rich plains and you hit groundwater fast. The water table sits high. So the idea of a vast ocean under the earth wasn't just fantasy. It was their way of making sense of what they saw. But they didn't stop at just observing. They built a whole worldview around it. To them, the earth floated on this cosmic ocean, the Abzu, the source of all life. And Enki ruled the waters from his sanctuary in Eridu, controlling the flow that let civilization grow. Now close your eyes for a second and try to picture Eridu, not as a ruin, but as it might have looked 5,000 years ago. The temple climbing up in stepped layers from the flat land, its mud brick walls glowing white from lime plaster, incense filling the air, water trickling everywhere, in channels, cisterns, poured as offerings over sacred stones. Priests in white linen moving quietly through shadowy corridors. Prayers in that old, strange Sumerian language, nothing like anything you hear today. And in the middle of it all, something ancient and powerful, real or not, anchored to this exact spot, demanding to be noticed. According to the old stories, Enki played a hands-on role in making humanity. He teamed up with Ninhursag, the mother goddess, and together they shaped humans out of clay mixed with the blood of a slain god. That's how people got intelligence and skill, but also mortality and limits. The texts don't sugarcoat it. Humans were created to do the hard work the lesser gods didn't want to do anymore. That part stings a little, doesn't it? We like creation stories where humans are special, chosen, the top of the pyramid. The Sumerians, not so much. In their eyes, humans existed to serve. Keep the temples running, work the fields, take care of all the stuff the gods didn't want to bother with. But here's the twist. Enki shows up again and again as the one god on humanity's side. Whenever the other gods wanted to wipe people out, plagues, drought, famine, floods, Enki always found a way to help us survive. He taught people what they needed to know. He bent the rules, found loopholes, made sure humanity pulled through. Why did he do it? The texts don't spell it out. Maybe he felt responsible. Maybe he actually liked us. Or maybe, as a few old stories hint, he had his own reasons, his own plans that didn't quite match up with what the other gods wanted. There's a fascinating text called Enki and the World Order that describes how Enki traveled across the known world, assigning gods to oversee different regions and different functions, giving each one their domain, their responsibilities, their portion of the cosmic administration. One god got Dilmun, probably modern Bahrain, making it a paradise with fresh water and abundant date palms. Another got the Indus Valley. Another the mountains of Anatolia. Another the marshlands where reeds grew for building and writing. Enki organized the world like someone, setting up a management structure, establishing departments, assigning roles, creating a system. And here's a detail that never quite gets enough attention. The text says Enki did this after the flood, after the catastrophe that destroyed the antediluvian world, after humanity had to start over. It's a restoration project, putting civilization back together according to a pattern that had existed before, making sure the same fundamental structure was preserved, even though the actual continuity had been broken. This theme of rebuilding according to an older pattern shows up Again and again in Sumerian texts, king after king claims not to have invented or improved, but to have restored the temple as it was in ancient days, or rebuilt according to the old plans. Even in the earliest written records, the Sumerians are looking backward. They're maintaining something rather than creating something new, which raises an uncomfortable question. What if they're right? What if Sumerian civilization really was built on the ruins of something older? The archaeological evidence actually supports this possibility, though archaeologists are cautious about saying so directly. We know now that agriculture began in the Fertile Crescent around 10,000 BCE. That's 6,500 years before the Sumerians. Settled villages appear in the archaeological record around 9,000 BCE. Pottery around 7,000 BCE. All of this is pre-Sumerian. What the Sumerians added suddenly, around 3,500 BCE, was writing. Cities, complex mathematics, monumental architecture, sophisticated government administration, but they built all of this on foundations that were already ancient. And they said so themselves. They never claimed to have invented civilization from scratch. They said it was given to them, taught to them, lowered from heaven by the Anunnaki. At Eridu, in the oldest levels, American archaeologist Fuad Safar found something that puzzled him. Among the foundations of Temple I, the earliest structure, he discovered foundation deposits, caches of objects buried deliberately beneath the building corners. In ancient Mesopotamia, foundation deposits were the norm. Builders buried inscribed cylinders, precious things, and offerings to the gods, asking for a bit of luck and protection over their new construction. But Eridu stands out. The deposits at Eridu held objects that were already antiques when Temple I went up. Pottery from earlier times, stone tools from before people even knew how to make pots. It's like the builders went artifact hunting, collecting relics from the past on purpose, then hiding them in the temple's foundations. Why do that? Maybe they wanted to show they weren't the first. This ground was sacred long before their temple ever existed. They weren't starting something new. They were picking up where someone else left off, paying respect to an ancient holiness. Or just a theory here. Maybe they were literally building on top of something older. Another structure could have stood there once, wiped out by a flood, or just lost to time. Maybe those old artifacts were leftovers from that vanished building, mixed into the new foundation. We'll probably never get a clear answer. The oldest layers at Eridu are buried under the water table now. Digging any deeper would take massive effort and probably won't ever happen. Whatever secrets rest beneath Temple I are stuck down there, hidden in the mud and water that's taken the place back. Still, the questions won't quit. How old is Eridu really? How deep does its story go? What was there before the Sumerians showed up? Ancient texts say Enki was already there before humans. He chose his home at that spot before there were cities, before farming, before civilization was even a thing. They say he lived underground in the Abzu, the watery deep, in a palace of lapis lazuli and silver, ruling the primordial waters. And then at the right moment he brought out humanity. He taught them, gave them the tools of civilization, made them who they were. Is it myth? Sure, but what's behind the myth? What real shifts, what actual meetings, what strange events sparked these stories? If you find yourself standing in the ruins at Eridu, you can feel the mystery in the air. The Sumerians believed something happened here, something big, something that changed everything. This is where they built their first, holiest temple. They kept it going for 3,000 years. That kind of devotion hints they weren't just telling stories. They were marking something they thought was real. Maybe Enki was a god. Maybe he was a wise stranger, a memory of someone who brought new knowledge. Maybe he was only a legend. For the Sumerians, it didn't matter. To them, he was the one who made them who they were. That belief shaped their world. It shaped what they built, what they wrote, what they pressed into clay and left behind when the cities themselves faded away. Now Eridu is gone, the temples are broken, the priests are long dead. The sacred waters have dried up or changed course, but the memory is still here. The story hasn't vanished, and the question, what really happened at Eridu, still drifts on the desert wind. The Divine Council, how the Anunnaki Governed. People usually miss this about the Anunnaki. They didn't rule on their own. They weren't lone dictators or gods doing whatever they wanted. They worked as a council, a group that argued, debated, and actually voted on what to do. That's not just a minor detail. It flips the whole story. It shows us how the Sumerians saw their gods, and by extension, how they thought society should work. They imagined their gods running things not like kings, but as a council with formal rules, hierarchy, and real procedures. The Sumerian texts talk about the Ubshuakina, the assembly of the great gods. Picture something closer to parliament than a king's court. Anu, the sky god, was the top dog, but even he couldn't just boss everyone around. He had to make proposals, argue his case, and listen to others. The gods debated, then they voted. The council decided together. Enlil, who ran things on Earth, had a lot of clout. But when he wanted to wipe out humanity with a flood, he couldn't just snap his fingers. He had to win the council over. He made his pitch and they voted. Even then, Enki found a loophole and saved humanity on a technicality. No single god could just bulldoze the others. Their power came from the group, not the individual. Honestly, this is incredible political thinking for 4,000 or 5,000-year-old stories. The Sumerians didn't write about gods as absolute monarchs. They pictured something more like an oligarchy or even a democracy. Multiple powerful figures, each with a voice, working within set rules and keeping each other in check. And the Sumerians wanted their own society to work the same way. Their cities weren't run by all-powerful kings. Sure, there was a king, but he wasn't the only source of authority. You also had powerful temple officials, a council of elders, and an assembly of citizens. These groups had to work together, bargain, cut deals, and reach consensus when it really mattered. Divine government was the blueprint for human government. As above, so below, as they might have said. So, what did these godly assemblies actually look like? The council met in Nippur, the religious heart of Sumer, inside Enlil's temple, the Ekur, the mountain house. Nippur wasn't the biggest city or the richest, but it was neutral ground, sacred to everyone. That made it the perfect place for the gods to gather and make decisions affecting the world. When big issues came up, creating humanity, deciding to send the flood, settling godly squabbles, or weighing the fate of cities, the Anunnaki would assemble. The texts get surprisingly detailed about how this worked. First, a messenger god would summon each member of the council. This wasn't optional. If a god couldn't make it, they'd send a stand-in. The gods would arrive at the assembly hall, the Ubshuakina, which the texts describe as stunning. Lapis lazuli, precious metals, every seat arranged by rank. Anu called things to order. Then Enlil, acting almost like a prime minister, would present whatever issue needed group approval. The debates weren't just for show. The gods clashed, argued different sides, and didn't always agree. When Enlil wanted to destroy humanity with famine, Enki pushed back. When the flood was on the table, Enki, or E in Akkadian, argued for mercy. He didn't always win, but the fact that dissent was possible, and even written down, says a lot about how this system worked. After the debate, they'd vote. The texts don't spell out exactly how the voting worked. Was it majority rule, unanimous, something in between? But it's clear the decisions belonged to the group. Once the council made a decision, it stuck. Enlil couldn't just change his mind about the flood halfway through. The gods had voted, the decree was set, and even the highest-ranking god had to honor what the group decided. The 7 Anunnaki judges played a special role in this system. They were described as the great princes who decree the fates. There. particular function was to make binding determinations about destiny, both for individuals and for humanity collectively. When someone died, the Anunnaki judges determined their fate in the underworld. When a city offended the gods, the Anunnaki decreed its punishment. When humanity's future hung in the balance, the Anunnaki voted on what would happen. This judicial function was central to their identity. The Anunnaki weren't primarily creators or warriors or teachers, though individual members of the council might fulfill those roles. Their defining characteristic was judgment. They were the cosmic judges, the determiners of fate, the ones who fixed destiny. In the descent of Inanna to the underworld, when the great goddess arrives in the land of the dead, she's brought before the Anunnaki judges. They fasten their eyes of death upon her, a phrase that suggests their judgment was more than verbal decree. It was an actual power, an ability to impose their will on reality itself. Inanna dies because the Anunnaki judges decree it. She hangs dead on a hook for 3 days. She returns to life only because Enki creates clever beings who can circumvent the judgment through technicality. They're neither alive nor dead, so the rules of the underworld don't fully apply to them. Even divine judgment, it seems, had limits, had edges where clever beings could find exemptions. This whole system, the formal assembly, the voting procedures, the binding decrees, the possibility of legal circumvention reveals something fascinating about Sumerian theology. They didn't conceive of divine power as arbitrary or capricious. The gods weren't cruel tyrants, doing whatever they wanted whenever they felt like it. They weren't just gods. They were administrators, bureaucrats, really. The Sumerians pictured their deities working inside a cosmic system of laws, a network that tied their hands almost as much as it gave them power. Why would people dream up gods like that? Why make the heavens look like a complicated, legalistic government? Honestly, it probably came down to what they saw around them. Sumerian life revolved around temple-palace complexes, and those places ran on bureaucracy. Scribes wrote everything down. Every contract mattered. Laws applied to everyone, even the king. Rules, procedures, precedents, that was daily life. So when they looked up, they saw the same order reflected in the sky. They imagined their gods navigating a cosmic bureaucracy, following rules and holding meetings, just like the humans below. But let's not stop there. There's another angle, one that's less comfortable but kind of intriguing. What if the Sumerians didn't invent this system to mirror their own? What if they organized their cities this way because that's what they believed the gods actually did? Maybe the Anunnaki, if they were real and not just stories, genuinely ruled by consensus and vote, and they taught humans to copy them. Either way, you end up with a striking political philosophy. The Sumerians baked ideas about shared power, collective decision-making, and the rule of law right into their origin stories. This isn't superstition. It's advanced thinking about how to run a society. And these ideas show up in some of humanity's oldest writings. That means either the Sumerians were politically sophisticated much earlier than we give them credit for, or they somehow got their hands on knowledge that didn't come from their own everyday experience. This whole idea of a divine council also explains something else. In the stories, different gods have different takes on humanity. If the Anunnaki were a council full of personalities, each with their own opinions, priorities, and moods, their arguments make sense. Take Enlil. Stern sees humans as a noisy problem to manage, or Enki, clever, curious, protective. Then there's Inanna, wild, unpredictable, sometimes helping people, sometimes tearing cities apart. They aren't just bland archetypes. They're individuals, each trying to get what they want inside a system that forces them to bargain, vote, and compromise. That messiness, that complexity, it makes the Anunnaki seem less like symbols and more like real beings. If they were just cosmic metaphors, they'd act predictably, always fitting the same mold. But the stories show them as complicated, flawed, surprising, powerful, sure, but always hemmed in by rules and each other. Believe what you want about the Anunnaki, gods, ancient aliens, lost rulers, or pure legend. What matters is that the stories reveal a people thinking seriously about power. Who should have it? How should it be shared? What checks and balances keep it from going wrong? They wrap these questions up in tales of godly councils, debates, votes, and laws that even the gods couldn't break. That's not backward thinking. That's political sophistication, written in clay 5,000 years ago, just waiting for us to really pay attention. Enkai's gift to humanity, the secrets of civilization. If there's one god on the Anunnaki Council who really looks out for humanity, it's Enki. He shows up again and again in the old texts as our champion, always teaching, always backing us up. While the other gods argued about whether people were worth the trouble, Enki just kept working to help us survive and thrive. So what did he actually give us? What real, concrete things did Enki share with humanity from those ancient, pre-flood days? The old stories don't leave this vague. They get pretty specific. And they're not talking about vague wisdom or moral lessons. They describe hands-on know-how, practical skills and technology that changed everything, that made civilization possible. Let's start with water. The Sumerians said every bit of their knowledge about irrigation, canals, and managing water came from Enki. Makes sense. He was the god of fresh water, the Abzu. But the stories go beyond. Enki taught us irrigation. They talk about the nuts and bolts. One clay tablet spells it out. Enki showed humans how to dig canals at just the right angle. Too steep, and the water rushes through, tearing up the banks. Too flat, and the water just sits there, gets muddy, and turns useless. You need the angle to be spot on. That's not the kind of thing you figure out overnight. Either you spend years making mistakes, or someone who already knows shows you how it's done. The Sumerians got really good at this. Their irrigation networks kept whole cities alive in a place that should have been desert. Without precision water management, none of it would have worked. And they always credited Enki. Not with magic, but with real teaching, passing down technical skills, person to person. Another story talks about Enki teaching people how to find water underground, where to dig wells, how deep to go, what signs to look for. Again, it's practical know-how that somebody had to work out first. The Sumerians said Enki did. Then there's farming. Sumerians didn't invent agriculture. That started earlier in the Fertile Crescent, but they took it to the next level. They bred crops that fit their land. They worked out crop rotation. They even used the stars to plan when to plant and when to harvest. Their texts say Enki and the goddess Ninhursag teamed up to teach humans how to farm right. There's a story, debate between grain and sheep, where humans start out eating grass until the gods step in and hand over real crops and animals. Metalworking comes next, and that was a game changer. Copper wasn't even found in Mesopotamia, and tin, needed for bronze, came from far away. They had to trade for the raw stuff, then smelt it at crazy high temperatures, then mix metals just right to make bronze. That's not something you just stumble onto. Somebody has to know what they're doing, or you spend generations figuring it out. The Sumerians said Enki taught them metallurgy. There's this city, Babylonian, called Fortress of the Metal Workers. The old stories suggest people knew metalworking before the flood, lost it in the chaos, and had to relearn it later from the scraps of knowledge that survived. And then there's writing, the big one. The thing that let the Sumerians record all of this. They said Enki and the goddess Nisaba, who's either his daughter or his assistant, depending on the story, gave them writing. And here's the weird thing. Writing in Sumer didn't start out simple and then get more complex. The first cuneiform, around 3200 BCE, is already a full system, more than 1,000 signs. It can handle names, numbers, stories, anything. It's like someone sat down and built a complete writing system from day one. No slow crawl from drawings to letters, just the whole thing ready to go. The Sumerians always said Enki handed them this gift. He showed the first scribes how to press marks into clay, turning words and ideas into something that could last forever. But some of it is surprisingly sophisticated. The texts describe surgical procedures including trepanation, drilling holes in skulls too. Relieve pressure, treatment of cataracts setting broken bones. These aren't techniques you develop casually. They require anatomic knowledge, understanding of infection risks, access to effective tools. The Sumerians credited Enki and the goddess Gyula with teaching medicine. They described how the gods revealed which plants had healing properties, which substances were poisonous, how to prepare medications correctly. And then there's the most mysterious gift attributed to Enki, the me. We touched on this earlier, but it deserves deeper examination. The me, pronounced me, were divine powers or principles that governed every aspect of civilization. They were described as discrete objects that could be possessed, transferred, even stolen. In the text Inanna and Enki, the goddess Inanna travels to Eridu and gets Enki drunk. In his intoxicated state, he gives her over 100 me, everything from kingship and priesthood to metalworking and leatherworking to music and song. Inanna loads these me onto her boat and transports them to Uruk. When Enki sobers up and realizes what he's done, he tries to get them back. But Inanna has already reached Uruk and claimed them for her city. What are the me, really? They're described as physical objects, things that can be carried, stored, transferred, but they're also clearly more than just artifacts. They enable capabilities. Without the me for metalworking, you can't work metal. Without the me for writing, you can't write. One interpretation is that the me represent knowledge systems or technologies, perhaps encoded information like instruction manuals or training programs that had to be accessed to enable specific skills. Some people think the me are just symbols, basically metaphors for the way cultural habits and traditions spread from city to city. But there's another angle. What if the me were real objects or tools? Imagine Enki actually owned advanced tech that kept civilization running, and he decided who got to use it. He could hand out these devices to different cities when he felt like it. Suddenly, Inanna sneaking away with the me makes a lot more sense. She wasn't just asking Enki to teach her city new tricks. She was physically taking the stuff that let those skills happen. She moved the technology itself from Eridu, Enki's base, to Uruk, her own turf. This could be why the old stories treat the me like treasures worth fighting over. If the me were just ideas or customs, anyone could copy them. But if they were actual gadgets or rare resources, having them would be a really big deal. We'll probably never pin down exactly what the me were. The ancient texts are maddening, sometimes too detailed, sometimes annoyingly vague. But one thing is obvious. Sumerians believed civilization's most important skills came from outside themselves. Enki owned them, kept them in Eridu, and handed them out when he chose. So is this just a myth about how society grows, the memory of some genius visitor, or something else? Doesn't really matter. The pattern's right there. The Sumerians didn't say they figured everything out on their own. They said someone gave it to them. That someone was Enki, god of wisdom, lord of the Abzu, the creator of humanity, the one who kept saving people, even when other gods wanted them gone for being too loud or troublesome. If any of the Anunnaki actually cared about humans, wanted them to thrive, kept stepping in to nudge them forward, it was always Enki. And look at the gifts he supposedly handed out: irrigation, farming, metalworking, writing, law, medicine, the me themselves. All the critical stuff that let Sumerian civilization bloom in a place that was otherwise pretty unforgiving. God, teacher, legend, or just a story, Whatever Enki was, the Sumerians credited him with everything that made their world work. They never claimed they did it alone. They always said someone taught them, and they remembered his name. The flood that ended an age. Let's stick with the flood story a bit longer. This is the moment everything in the Sumerian texts turns, where the whole story shifts from one kind of world to something entirely new. The oldest version we've got is the Eridu Genesis. It's just fragments, but the pieces we do have are wild with detail. The flood isn't about the gods punishing humans for being bad. Not really. It's almost like they overreacted. They took things way too far. People had multiplied, cities boomed. Humans were doing a little too well for the gods' liking. That word, noise, shows up again and again. Enlil, the chief god, couldn't sleep. Humanity had gotten out of hand. Too many people, too much noise. Civilization was a bit much. So the gods held a meeting. They tried other fixes first. Plague to thin the herd. But Enki, the clever god, taught people medicine. Drought to bring famine. Enki just showed them irrigation and how to store food. Every time, Enki quietly sabotaged their plans. Finally, Enlil pushed for the nuclear option, a flood, wipe the world clean, make things quiet again the way they were before people filled it up. The council agreed. Enlil's plan won. Even Enki had to swear he wouldn't warn the humans. But Enki found a loophole. He didn't warn anyone directly. He whispered the secret to a reed wall. Ziusudra, a man sleeping nearby, just happened to overhear. Build a boat, seal it with pitch, gather seeds of every living thing. The storm's coming. Now here's the thing. Why did the Sumerians, people who lived with floods every year, turn their regular river flooding into a story about the end of the world? Because this wasn't just another flood. Something about it was on a totally different scale. Archaeologists digging at old Sumerian cities like Uruk, and Shuruppak found thick layers of flood-borne clay dropped right in the middle of ancient settlements. No pottery, no bones, just clean silt. In some places, it's 6 to 10 feet thick. That's not a minor flood. That's a disaster big enough to drown whole cities. Back in 1929, Leonard Woolley found one of these layers at 8 feet of clean clay right under the royal cemetery. He sent a famous telegram. We have found the flood. But here's the twist. Those big floods around 2900 BCE probably weren't the flood from the ancient king list. That legendary flood was meant to mark the end of an age, much further back in time. The 2900 BCE floods were just the most recent in a string of disasters the Sumerians remembered. So when did the Great Flood actually hit? Did it ever? Let's zoom out for a second. Around 10,800 BCE, Earth's climate went haywire. The Younger Dryas period ended and temperatures shot up. Ice sheets collapsed. Sea levels surged, up by 30 to 50 feet in less than a century. If you were living by the coast or in a river valley, that was the end of your world. The Persian Gulf filled up during this time. What's underwater now used to be a huge green valley where people almost certainly lived. Genetic studies show people were there before the flood, then scattered as the sea rolled in. These folks carried their stories with them, memories of a lost homeland, passed down for thousands of years. By the time the Sumerians learned to write, those stories were already ancient. So maybe the Sumerians' flood story isn't just a myth about local rivers. Maybe it's a memory, an echo of a real disaster that wiped out a world people actually lived in, 8,000 years before anyone wrote it down. 8 millennia of retelling, details shifting, but the heart of it staying the same. Once, our ancestors lived somewhere else, and the waters came and took it all away. The Sumerian flood account includes details that feel oddly specific for pure mythology, the boat's dimensions, the 7 days and nights of rain, the dove sent out to search for dry land, the sacrifice Ziusudra offers when he reaches dry land, and the gods who have been without. Human offerings during the flood gathering, like flies over the sacrifice. That last detail is particularly telling. The gods need humans, not for worship in some abstract spiritual sense, but for practical reasons. Humans maintain temples, make offerings, provide food for divine consumption. Without humans, the gods go hungry. This isn't the usual relationship between deity and worshipper. This is symbiotic, transactional. The gods provide protection and knowledge. Humans provide labor and sustenance. It's a contract. The flood wipes out almost everyone. Just one family makes it through. Suddenly, the gods realize they've made a mess of things. They got rid of their own workers. So when Ziusudra survives, thanks to Enki's clever warning, the gods do something surprising. They don't punish him. Instead, they give him eternal life and send him off to Dilmun to live forever. But the gods aren't about to repeat their mistakes. They want to keep humans from getting out of hand again. Too many people, too much noise. So they lay down new rules: shorter lives, sickness, predators. The old stories spell it out pretty clearly. The gods didn't want humans wiped out, just kept in check. Death isn't just natural here. It's a rule the gods put in place. Before the flood, things looked totally different. The ancient kings supposedly lived for tens of thousands of years. The line between gods and humans was thin. The Anunnaki walked around with people, just part of the crowd. After the flood, all that faded. Lifespans shrank. The gods stepped back. The days of easy contact ended. Something big changed. Maybe the Anunnaki just left. Maybe the world itself couldn't support long life anymore. Maybe the divine blood got diluted after everything fell apart. The old stories don't spell out exactly why, but they all agree. The world after the flood was smaller, duller, less magical. That's why Gilgamesh can't win his fight for immortality. He's chasing something from the old world, trying to claim what the ancient kings had. But he's too late. That door isn't open anymore. Utnapishtim tries to explain. Do we build houses to last forever? Do contracts hold for all time? Nothing sticks around. The old world's gone. Every ancient culture has some version of this lost golden age. The Hindus call it Satya Yuga. The Greeks had their golden age under Kronos. The Norse remembered the time before Ragnarok. Different names, same story. Everyone misses what was lost. And right in the middle of the Sumerian version, you find the Anunnaki. The ones who lived in both worlds, saw what was lost, and set the rules for the one we're left with. SCRTS written in clay. Let's get down to what these tablets really are, what they're made of, how they were put together. Because honestly, that's the key to why they're still around when just about everything else from the ancient world has vanished. Clay lasts in a way that wood, papyrus, or even stone just can't match. Wood rots. Papyrus turns to dust. Stone wears away, cracks, or gets scratched up. But once you fire a clay tablet, bake it until it's hard, it's almost impossible to destroy. The Sumerians got this. They didn't pick clay by accident. They wanted something that would last. Picture a scribe in Uruk, maybe around 2600 BCE. This guy has been training since he was a kid, learning cuneiform at temple schools. It's not easy. Over 1,000 different signs, each with a handful of possible meanings. He grabs a lump of wet clay about the size of a paperback and starts working. He's got a reed stylus with a wedge-shaped tip and presses marks into the soft clay. He has to move fast before it dries. Every sign is a mix of wedges, horizontal, vertical, diagonal. He's not coming up with anything new. He's copying an older tablet, probably already ancient in his day. Maybe pieces of the old one have broken off, or some lines have faded away. Where the text gets fuzzy, he notes it. Original damaged here, or text uncertain. He's not trying to be an author. He's more like a caretaker, just one link in a chain that stretches back generations. And with luck, we'll keep going after him. His job is to keep things alive, not invent something new. When he's done, the tablet goes into a kiln. The heat turns it from breakable clay into something closer to stone. Even if the temple gets burned or destroyed, the tablets might get buried, but they won't disappear. That's the reason we know what we know about the Sumerians. They wrote everything down and they made sure it would last. Admin records, contracts, laws, math, medicine, astronomy, prayers, myths and legends, letters, literature. And copies, so many copies. They'd rewrite the same important texts again and again, stash them in different places. It's like they understood redundancy before we even had a word for it. If one got lost, another would survive. The Epic of Gilgamesh. We've got versions from all over and from different centuries. That flood story shows up in at least 5 separate texts. The King List. There are more than a dozen copies out there. When Ashurbanipal's library in Nineveh burned down in 612 BCE, the fire that destroyed the building actually baked the tablets even harder, locking them in for us to find. The library itself is gone, but the archives survived. And here's what's wild. The Assyrians copying those tablets in 700 BCE were already working with ancient stuff. The Sumerian stories about the Anunnaki and the flood were already 2,000, sometimes 3,000 years old by then. Imagine us today carefully copying Roman manuscripts, except these were preserving texts way older than Rome. Why did these stories matter so much? Why did people keep them safe for thousands of years? These were the big foundational myths. They explained where civilization came from, who the gods were, how people fit into the universe. But there's something strange about these Sumerian texts. They hardly ever change. The same gods show up with the same roles, even in texts separated by 1,000 years. Enki is always the clever god of water. Enlil stays the strict ruler. Inanna never stops being the goddess of love and war. Their relationships stay the same. Their personalities don't shift. It almost feels like the writers thought of these gods as real people, so real that no one dared to tweak their traits. And the texts don't even pretend to be just stories. The king list straight up says it's history, a list of actual kings. The shift from mythical rulers to real, archaeologically confirmed kings happens without missing a beat. When the tablets describe the Anunnaki making decisions, they use the language of bureaucracy. Council meetings, votes, debates, legal issues. It reads more like a government memo than a myth. That's one of the weirdest things about these texts. The gods aren't distant or mysterious. They're organized, they follow rules, they meet and argue, and they make decisions through set procedures. Some tablets go even further. They hold info that's meant to outlast disaster. Astronomical tables, math formulas, medical advice, farming how-tos. After the flood, survivors wanted to make sure knowledge would never be lost again. So they wrote it all down, made it permanent, spread out the copies. The texts about the Anunnaki probably had the same goal. They wanted to lock in everything important, who these beings were, what they did, what they taught, and what promises they made about coming back. Because that's the other thread running through these texts. The Anunnaki didn't just leave. They promised or threatened to return. References to cycles, to appointed times, to astronomical configurations. That would signal when the boundary between realms would thin again. The Sumerians tracked these cycles obsessively. They watched the sky. Constantly, they recorded planetary movements, lunar cycles, precession. Of equinoxes, not just for agriculture, but to know when the gods would return. Is that mythology, or instructions left by beings who departed, telling humans when to expect them back? The tablets have delivered their message. The only question is, are we listening? What they didn't want us to forget. As we get to the end of this journey, there's something I can't let slip by. The Sumerians thought these stories mattered so much, they went through real trouble to write them down. Writing wasn't easy for them. It took a lot of work, time, and money. Scribes spent years learning the craft. Making and firing clay tablets used up resources. You needed special places to store all those texts, and those places had to last. Still, the Sumerians kept at it. They copied and recopied these texts, not just once or twice, but over and over for centuries. Languages shifted, some of the meaning faded, but they didn't stop. Why go through all that? Because they believed these stories held essential truths. Not always literal history, but things that mattered. What it means to be human, where civilization came from, how we fit into a universe full of powers bigger than us. Those stories about the Anunnaki, they weren't just for entertainment. They were guides, warnings, promises, maps to the order of everything. The kind of thing you want to pass down in case someone really needs it one day. So when a Sumerian scribe sat copying out tales of floods or councils of gods or kings from before the deluge, he wasn't just doing a job. He was saving knowledge for the future. Maybe it wouldn't matter in his lifetime or even for centuries, but it would matter someday. And tucked into all these texts, like a thread running through cloth, is the belief that the Anunnaki would come back. You see it in their talk of appointed times, of cosmic cycles, of doors between worlds swinging open again. They watched the sky for signs. They tracked the precession of the equinoxes, a cycle that takes nearly 26,000 years to complete. That's not something you notice in a single lifetime. They charted planets with a level of precision people wouldn't match until telescopes came along. This wasn't just curiosity. They were getting ready, waiting for the sign that the age of separation was almost over. So here we are. Things are changing fast, maybe faster than ever before in history. The climate's in flux, technology keeps speeding up, the world's more connected than it's ever been, and old knowledge is coming back through archaeology and translation. We know more about the Sumerians now than anyone has since their language died out 4,000 years ago. Anyone with an internet connection can read their stories. The secrets they protected are open to us again. Is that just luck? Or is it part of the same cycle? Wisdom carried through the dark, waiting until we were ready to hear it. The Sumerians couldn't have guessed we'd end up reading their words, but they hoped we would. They fired their truths into clay, trusting those tablets to survive whatever came. And they were right. We're reading them now. Thousands of years later, those tablets still speak. What are they telling us? Maybe you read it as history, maybe as myth, but the message comes through. Civilization is fragile. Disasters happen. Ages end. But there's hope too. People survive. They rebuild. Knowledge endures if we care enough to save it. Humanity has come back from the edge before. The world before the flood vanished in water. The one that followed was smaller, rougher, but it hung on. People got used to shorter lives, to gods keeping their distance, to running things on their own. Maybe that's the real lesson here. Not just that gods once walked among us, though the old stories swear they did, but that people are stubborn and resilient. Civilization is something worth fighting for. Knowledge matters. Even scraps of memory, carried across 10,000 years, still count. Look at those tablets in a museum catalog. You're not just seeing old clay. You're reaching across 5,000 years. Real people pressed those marks. Real minds chose those words. They wanted you to know what they knew. They wanted you to remember what. They remembered. They wanted the story of the Anunnaki and the time. Before the flood to survive. And it has. Against all odds, these clay tablets have delivered their message to us. Whether the Anunnaki were gods, aliens, human rulers, or metaphorical constructs we may never know with certainty, the tablets don't resolve those questions. They just bear witness to what the Sumerians believed. But they do tell us clearly. The Sumerians took these stories seriously. They preserved them carefully. They considered them essential truth, worth protecting at great cost. That alone should make us pause. What if they were right? What if there really was an antediluvian age? What if catastrophic floods really did destroy advanced civilizations? What if beings called the Anunnaki really did interact with humanity in ways we've forgotten? We don't have to accept every detail literally to recognize that something real underlies these accounts, some actual history, some genuine catastrophe, some transformation profound enough to echo through every culture's mythology. The waters rose, the old world drowned, something ended that could never be fully restored. But humanity survived, and the survivors wrote down what they could remember, pressed it into clay, fired it hard, and buried it safely, trusting that someday we would find their testimony, that we would read their words and remember the time before the flood, when the Anunnaki walked the earth, when things were different. The tablets are real. You can visit them in museums, the British Museum in London, the Louvre in Paris, the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago. You can see the cuneiform marks pressed into clay by hands that have been dust for 5,000 years. And if you're quiet, if you're patient, if you let yourself really sit with what you're looking at, not just a museum artifact, but a message in a bottle cast across an ocean of time, you might feel what the Sumerians intended. Awe at deep history, humility before persistence of memory, recognition that we're part of a story that began long before we were born and will continue long after we're gone. And maybe a whisper of warning: the cycles haven't stopped. The patterns that destroyed the antediluvian world are still present. The sky is still there. The stars still follow their ancient paths. The cycles still turn. Are we watching? Are we prepared? The Sumerians were. They did their part. They preserved the knowledge. They watched the sky and waited for signs of the appointed time. Now it's our turn. What we do with their legacy will shape what we become. The tablets have delivered their message. The only question is, are we listening? Wherever you are tonight, whatever time it is in your part of the world, I hope this exploration has given you something to dream about, some small sense of the vast, mysterious depths of human history that we're only beginning to rediscover. The Sumerians are gone, their language is dead, their cities are dust. But their words survive, and in those words is a story that refuses to die. A story about a time before the flood, when the Anunnaki walked among us, when things were different, when the world we know was just beginning to take shape from something older, stranger, and more wondrous than we usually acknowledge. Sleep well, dream of ancient cities and primordial waters and beings whose nature we can barely imagine. And remember, the tablets are still there, still waiting, still speaking to anyone patient enough to listen. The secrets they preserve aren't lost. They've just been sleeping like you soon will be, waiting for the right moment to wake up again. Maybe that moment is now. Maybe it's still to come. Maybe the cycle has already begun to turn, and we just haven't recognized the signs yet. The Sumerians would tell us to watch the sky, to pay attention, to remember. So tonight, before you sleep, maybe take one last look at the stars. The same stars the Sumerian astronomers watched from their ziggurats. The same patterns they tracked so carefully, knowing that somewhere in those eternal cycles was the signal they were waiting for. The signal that the age of separation was ending, that the door between worlds was opening again, that what was lost might be found, that what ended might begin anew. Are the Anunnaki coming back, or were they never really gone? The tablets can't tell us. They can only preserve the question and trust that someday someone will find the answer. Rest now. Let these ancient mysteries wash over you like water. Let yourself drift into the deep, where memory and dream become indistinguishable. The Sumerians are waiting there, in the space between waking and sleeping, in the twilight where the past touches the present, in the eternal now, where clay tablets speak across the void and voices dead for 5,000 years, whisper secrets we've almost forgotten. Almost, but not quite. Never quite, because they wrote it down. They preserved it. They made sure we would remember. And here we are, remembering, just like they hoped we would. Sweet dreams wherever you are. May your sleep be deep and your dreams be filled with ancient wonders. The flood came once, it may come again, but the memory survives always. Forever written in clay, fired hard, waiting in the dark. Waiting for us to understand. Waiting for the cycle to complete. Waiting for the Anunnaki to return. Or to reveal they never really left at all. The astronomical knowledge that shouldn't exist. Let's get into something that stops even the most skeptical experts in their tracks. The Sumerians knew way more about astronomy than anyone would expect from people living 5,000 years ago. Seriously, these folks were charting the skies long before telescopes, modern math, or anything like the scientific method existed. And yet, their star maps and calculations go toe-to-toe with the best Europe produced until the Renaissance. Sometimes, they even come out ahead. Look at how they split the sky into 12 zodiac signs. We still use that system today. Aries, Taurus, Gemini. Those names sound Greek, but they're actually Mesopotamian. The Greeks just borrowed them from the Sumerians and Babylonians, who nailed down the zodiac ages before anyone in the West caught on. But here's the kicker. Dividing the sky like that isn't just about making neat sections. It means they understood precession, the slow wobble in Earth's axis that shifts the position of the stars. Imagine a spinning top starting to lose steam. That's how the planet wobbles, and over thousands of years it makes the stars drift. The vernal equinox, that first day of spring when the sun crosses the celestial equator, drifts backward through the zodiac, spending around 2,160 years in each sign. The full cycle takes almost 26,000 years. Just wrap your head around that. To notice precession, you need people watching the sky obsessively over generations. You'd have to realize, hey, the stars aren't quite where Grandpa said they'd be. And then you'd need the math chops to figure out exactly how fast things are shifting. Most people credit the Greek astronomer Hipparchus with discovering precession in 130 BCE. But the Sumerians, they had it down at least 2,000 years earlier, maybe even longer. How did they do it? Some clues come from the Babylonian Mulapin tablets, astronomical records from around 1000 BCE, but based on much older sources. These tablets track the first appearances of stars at dawn heliacal risings, and actually note how those dates change over time. This isn't amateur stargazing. It's careful, systematic, and mathematical, built on centuries of careful record-keeping, with one generation passing the torch to the next. And then things get even weirder. The Sumerians seem to have known about planets they shouldn't have been able to see, like Uranus and Neptune. You can't spot those without a telescope. Uranus wasn't officially discovered until 1781, Neptune not until 1846. But some people think Sumerian texts hint at knowledge of planets beyond Saturn. Sure, it's a controversial idea and mainstream scholars definitely push back, but you can't just ignore it. There's that famous cylinder seal, VA 243. Zecharia Sitchin argued it shows the whole solar system, plus an extra planet he called Nibiru. Critics say he's seeing things that aren't there, just decorative stars. The truth? We don't actually know. The seal's ambiguous enough that you can read it either way, depending on what you're looking for. Now let's talk about the Sumerian number system, base 60. We still use it for time, 60 seconds, 60 minutes, and for measuring circles, 360 degrees, which is 6 times 60. This all comes from the Sumerians, handed down through the Babylonians and Greeks. But why base 60? Most ancient cultures went with base 10 fingers, base 20 fingers and toes, or maybe base 12. Base 60 is rare. It's complicated, but it's powerful. 60 divides evenly by a ton of numbers, makes fractions and astronomical calculations way easier. It's almost suspicious how perfect base 60 is for astronomy. It's like someone designed it with the night sky in mind. And then there's the number 3600, the Sar. The Sumerians treated it as sacred. It pops up everywhere, especially in their king lists and myths. Every antediluvian king supposedly ruled for multiples of 3,600 years. Ululim, 28,800 years, that's 8 times 3,600. Alagar, 36,000 years, 10 times 3,600. The pattern goes on. Why 3,600? Some, like Sitchin, argue it's the orbital period of Nibiru, that mystery planet. Others say it's just a handy big number in base 60 math, since 60 times 60 is 3,600. No matter how you slice it, the Sumerians were doing things with numbers and stars that still leave us scratching our heads. But there's another possibility. What if 3,600 represents some other cycle, a precessional subcycle perhaps, or a different astronomical period that the Sumerians were tracking? The number appears too consistently, too deliberately to be arbitrary. It meant something specific to them. Then there's their knowledge of planetary movements. The Venus tablet of Amisajuka, which we mentioned earlier, tracks Venus's movements over a 21-year period with remarkable precision. Venus has a complex orbit, sometimes appearing as the morning star, sometimes as the evening star, sometimes disappearing behind the sun for weeks at a time. The tablet predicts when Venus will appear and disappear with accuracy. That requires either centuries of continuous observation or what? Some other source of information. Similarly, Babylonian astronomers could predict eclipses. Not perfectly, they didn't have the full mathematical model, but well, enough to know when eclipses were likely to occur. This requires understanding the Saros cycle, an 18-year period after which eclipses repeat in similar patterns. Again, discovering this cycle requires multi-generational observation and record-keeping, which the Babylonians definitely had, but did the Sumerians before them? And if so, how far back does this knowledge really go? The texts themselves offer an answer. The Anunnaki taught them. The god Enki and the goddess Nisaba were credited with revealing astronomical knowledge to humanity, teaching them how to observe the sky, how to track the movements of celestial bodies, how to calculate cycles and predict events. If we take this literally, if we assume the Anunnaki were actual beings with advanced knowledge, then Sumerian astronomy makes more sense. It wasn't developed slowly from scratch. It was taught, transmitted as a complete system from teachers who already understood it. If we take it metaphorically, if we assume the Anunnaki represent cultural memory of an earlier civilization, then we're left asking, which earlier civilization? Where did this knowledge come from? Originally, the conventional answer is that the Sumerians developed it themselves through patient observation and brilliant mathematics, which is possible. Humans are capable of extraordinary intellectual achievements. But the conventional answer struggles with the timeline. The Sumerians appear around 3500 BCE, with sophisticated astronomy already in place. There's no clear developmental period where we can see them figuring it out. They just have it. Like writing, like urban planning, like complex mathematics, it's all there from the start, as if they arrived with an instruction manual. And when we look at their astronomical texts, at the precision of their observations and the sophistication of their calculations, we have to ask, are we underestimating what ancient peoples could achieve? Or are we missing something about where their knowledge came from? The Sumerians themselves were clear about the answer. They said it came from the Anunnaki, from beings who descended from heaven and taught humanity the secrets of the sky. Whether those beings were gods, teachers from another civilization, or personifications of accumulated human knowledge, the Sumerians honored them by preserving their astronomical traditions with meticulous care. For thousands of years, they watched the sky as the Anunnaki had taught them. They tracked the cycles as they'd been instructed, and they recorded everything in their tablets, creating astronomical archives that would eventually allow us millennia later to reconstruct what they knew and marvel at how they knew it. The mystery of Göbekli Tepe, civilization before Sumer. Let's take a quick side trip to southeastern Turkey, because in 1996, archaeologist Klaus Schmidt started digging at a place that ended up turning everything we thought we knew about civilization upside down. I'm talking about Göbekli Tepe, Potbelly Hill. It's this huge temple complex with massive T-shaped stone pillars set in circles. Some of them weigh as much as 20 tons. They're covered with detailed carvings of animals and strange symbols. Here's the wild part. People built it around 9600 BCE, over 11,000 years ago. That's more than 6,000 years before the Sumerians, before agriculture, before pottery, way before we thought anyone could manage a project like this. The old story about civilization went like this. First, humans hunted and gathered. Then they figured out farming, which led to extra food. Those surpluses let some people specialize, and eventually specialists built cities and monuments. Göbekli Tepe throws that whole sequence out the window. The monument came first. Agriculture followed, maybe just to feed the people who built and looked after the site. And then around 8000 BCE, people didn't just walk away or let it fall apart. They buried the place, carefully, layer after layer of dirt, almost like they meant to hide or protect it for someone in the future. So what does all this mean for the Sumerians and those mysterious Anunnaki? It proves that advanced, organized society existed long before Sumer. Humans, or someone, were building huge ritual sites, running big construction projects, and passing down specialized know-how thousands of years before anyone invented writing. The Sumerian king list talks about cities before the flood, about a world that was completely different, about wisdom that came before the civilization we can actually trace. What if they weren't just making it up? What if Sumer wasn't the first? Maybe the Sumerians inherited knowledge from an earlier age that mostly vanished. Göbekli Tepe cracks open the door to a much older, richer human history than most archaeologists have admitted. And it's not just Göbekli Tepe. There's Karahan Tepe, Nevali Sari, and other huge sites in the same region, built between 9600 and 6000 BCE. Looks like there was a whole culture thriving here for thousands of years. But then around 6000 BCE, something changed. People abandoned or buried these places. The culture faded, knowledge scattered. What happened? Climate change. The land shifted fast. Fertile areas dried out. Other places flooded. People had to move. Some of these refugees probably headed south, into Mesopotamia, taking their traditions with them. So by the time the Sumerians show up in the historical record around 3500 BCE, they might not have been inventing civilization from scratch. Maybe they were picking up the pieces of something older, trying to remember and rebuild what had been lost. That would explain why Sumerian culture seems to just appear fully formed. They weren't guessing. They were piecing things back together. The Sumerians even said so. Their stories talk about restoring the old ways, rebuilding based on ancient designs, and receiving wisdom from the Anunnaki, the ones who came before. Maybe the Anunnaki are just memories of those early builders, the people who put up places like Göbekli Tepe. Suddenly, the mythology doesn't sound so strange. The time before the flood, Not just a legend, more like a real memory passed down for thousands of years before anyone wrote it down. The Great Flood itself, probably not a single disaster, but a mashup of several climate crises that rocked the ancient world between 10,000 and 3000 BCE. And the Anunnaki, not aliens but the ancestors, those ancient builders with advanced knowledge scattered by catastrophe. Their descendants spread out across the Near East, carrying fragments of what they knew. Some eventually regrouped in Mesopotamia and became the Sumerians. They kept their old stories alive. They remembered the gods who taught their ancestors. They built ziggurats that echoed the old stone circles. And when they finally invented writing, they locked those memories into clay, creating the Anunnaki legends and tales of the world before the flood that still puzzle us today. This interpretation doesn't require believing in ancient astronauts or supernatural beings. It just requires accepting that human civilization is older and more complex than we've traditionally acknowledged. That before Sumer there were others, that knowledge was lost and partially recovered, that the Sumerians looked backward to a golden age, because there really had been an earlier age of achievement that their civilization was trying to recreate. Göbekli Tepe is still being excavated. New discoveries keep emerging, and each one suggests that we've barely scratched the surface of how deep human civilization really goes. The Sumerians knew this. They said it explicitly. They weren't first. They were inheritors, rebuilders, keepers of ancient knowledge. Whether the Anunnaki were literally the Göbekli Tepe builders, or whether they represent something else entirely, the principle remains. The Sumerians preserved memory of something that came before them. And the more we excavate sites like Göbekli Tepe, the more we realize they might have been right. Nibiru, Planet X and the Return. You can't really talk about the Anunnaki without bumping right into Zecharia Sitchin and his whole Planet X, Nibiru, idea. Back in 1976, Sitchin dropped his book, The 12th Planet, and threw out a wild claim. The Anunnaki were aliens from a planet called Nibiru, swinging through our solar system every 3,600 years. According to him, these beings showed up on Earth about 450,000 years ago, looking for gold. They genetically engineered humans to do the dirty work and supposedly come back every time their planet gets close to ours. Mainstream scholars, they've ripped this theory apart. Sitchin's translations of Sumerian texts are full of mistakes. The physics doesn't add up. There's no sign of a big, hidden planet on that kind of orbit anywhere in our solar system. Yet people love his books. Millions of copies sold. The theory is still everywhere. Why? Honestly, it's because the idea hooks into something deep. The thought that we're not alone, that super-intelligent visitors shaped our history, that there's more to our story than just a slow crawl from caves to cities. It's also a catch-all for weird mysteries. Why did civilization pop up so fast? Aliens did it. How'd ancient people move those giant stones? Alien tech. Where did the Sumerians get their astronomical smarts? Advanced beings taught them. It's a neat package, maybe too neat. But let's give Sitchin and his fans a little credit. Even if his specific story falls apart, he asked questions worth thinking about. How did the Sumerians get so advanced so early? Why do their stories talk about the Anunnaki like they're actual flesh and blood beings? Who were those legendary pre-flood rulers if not ordinary humans? These are good questions. They deserve real attention, even if Sitchin's answers don't work. Now about Nibiru. Sitchin pulled the name from Mesopotamian astronomy. The word Nibiru shows up in Babylonian texts, but scholars agree it means Jupiter, not some ghost planet lurking out past Pluto. In the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation story, Nibiru is Marduk's star. Marduk, after beating Tiamat, gets Nibiru as his mark in the sky. Sitchin took it further. He claimed Tiamat was actually a planet, shattered in a cosmic smash-up that made the asteroid belt. He read the old myths as literal astronomy, not just story. Most experts say this is just creative rewriting, not real translation. The Enuma Elish is mythology, full of cosmic images and gods fighting for power, not a science lesson about how planets form. So who's right? The academic view is pretty clear. Sitchin's methods are shaky, his translations cherry-picked. His astronomy doesn't fit what we know. But here's the thing. Just because Sitchin got it wrong doesn't mean the questions are pointless. There's still something strange about how Sumerian civilization appeared. The sudden leap, the whole bundle of inventions, the claims over and over that it all came from the Anunnaki. Maybe there weren't ancient astronauts. Maybe we just haven't found evidence for an even older human culture. Or maybe ancient people were just way sharper than we give them credit for. The mystery's still there. And as long as it is, people are going to keep looking for answers, some more believable than others. The idea of cycles is worth a closer look, too. Lots of ancient cultures believed in repeating ages and big cosmic clocks. The Hindus have their yugas, 4 ages, each one worse than the last, ending in destruction and renewal. The whole cycle lasts 4.32 million years. The Mayans ran several overlapping calendars, including the long count. That one wrapped up a 5,125-year run on December 21, 2012. Not the end of the world, but just the end of one cycle and the start of another. The Greeks talked about golden, silver, bronze, and iron ages. And the Sumerians themselves had these 3,600-year solar cycles, convinced that the cosmos shifted gears on a grand timetable. So if the Anunnaki really promised to come back on schedule, is it time? If you go by Sitchin's math, if that 3,600-year orbit was real, Nibiru would be swinging by soon. Some die-hard fans say it's already here, hiding behind the sun or creeping in from some odd angle. NASA has explicitly stated multiple times that no such planet exists. Our surveys of the outer solar system are comprehensive enough that a large planet would have been detected. But setting aside the literal planet theory, what about the broader concept? What if return of the Anunnaki doesn't mean physical beings from space arriving on Earth, but rather the rediscovery of ancient knowledge through archaeology, the completion of astronomical cycles the Sumerians were tracking, a shift in human consciousness or capability, the recognition that we've entered a new age of the long cycle. These interpretations don't require believing in Planet X, they just require acknowledging that we might be living through a significant transition point in some larger pattern. The Sumerians would tell us to watch the sky, to track the cycles, to be prepared for change when the appointed time arrives. Whether that's literal advice about astronomical phenomena or metaphorical wisdom about being attentive to patterns of history, it's worth considering. The tablets were written to preserve knowledge across catastrophic disruptions of civilization. They were meant to help survivors navigate the world after everything familiar had been destroyed. If we're wise, we'll treat them as what they are, messages from people who survived the ending of their world and wanted to help us survive the ending of ours whenever that might come. The modern rediscovery, when the tablets started speaking again. Something wild happened in the 1800s and 1900s. After thousands of years buried and forgotten, the Sumerian tablets finally started talking again. Just figuring out how to read them was a story on its own. When Layard's discoveries landed in Europe in the 1840s, nobody had a clue how to read cuneiform. The writing was totally dead. No one remembered it, and there was no handy Rosetta Stone to unlock the code. So scholars had to start from zero. Sir Henry Rawlinson cracked the code by staring at the Behistun inscription in Persia. It's this gigantic rock carving with the same message written in three languages: Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. By lining up what he knew from Persian with the mysterious Babylonian, he slowly pieced together how cuneiform worked. But then the real twist hit. The Babylonian tablets kept turning up with even older texts in a language no one recognized: Sumerian. Imagine realizing you're not just dealing with one lost language, but two. And the older one, Sumerian, didn't fit into any family tree. It stood alone. Nothing else like it. Cracking Sumerian took decades. Scholars had to. 1. Figure out which symbols were Sumerian and which were Akkadian. 2. Guess at Sumerian grammar by looking at context. 3. Build up vocabulary lists from texts written in both languages. 4. Test their translations over and over with new material. 5. Keep reworking everything as fresh tablets came in. Things really broke open in the early 1900s when people like Arno Pobel and later Samuel Noah Kramer started making Sumerian literature readable in English. Suddenly, these voices from 4,000 years ago came alive, and what they said, nobody expected it. These weren't just ancient myths. The stories were rich, layered, full-on literature with complicated plots and deep questions about life, suffering, justice, what it means to exist. Everyone's heard of the Epic of Gilgamesh now, dug out of Ashurbanipal's library. Turns out it's the oldest known work of literature. Friendship, death, searching for purpose, these themes still hit home. The flood story stunned Victorian readers. Here was a flood myth that came long before the Bible. That discovery rattled old assumptions and forced people to ask tough questions about influence and origins. Then there were the Anunnaki stories. Every time someone translated a new tablet, the picture got sharper. The Anunnaki acted as judges. They met in council to make big decisions. They made humans to do the hard work. They sent a flood to thin out the human race. One of them, Enki, kept stepping in to help people survive. American museums jumped in. The University of Pennsylvania Museum built up a massive collection. At the University of Chicago, the Oriental Institute led the way with new digs and better ways to study ancient texts. American scholars made a huge difference. Samuel Noah Kramer spent half a century translating and publishing Sumerian stories. Thorkild Jacobsen gave everyone new ways to interpret them. A. Leo Oppenheim put together giant dictionaries. That's how the world finally started to hear what Sumeria had to say. They built on earlier European work, but added specifically American. Scholarly rigor, systematic approaches, technological innovation, collaborative methods that pooled knowledge across institutions. By the 1970s, when Sitchin published his Ancient Astronaut Theories, the academic groundwork had been laid. We had reliable translations. We understood Sumerian grammar and vocabulary reasonably well. We could read the texts about the Anunnaki in their original language, which made Sitchin's mistranslations obvious to specialists, even as his. Books became bestsellers among general audiences. This created a strange split. In academia, Sumerian studies continued, quietly publishing new translations, discovering new texts, refining understanding of Sumerian civilization. In popular culture, the Anunnaki became alien overlords. Nibiru became a rogue planet and ancient. Mesopotamia became proof of ancient astronauts. The gap between scholarly consensus and public perception widened. Today, thanks to digital technology, this gap is starting to close. Electronic Text Corpus of Sumerian Literature, ETCSL, created by Oxford University, puts thousands of Sumerian compositions online in English. Translation: anyone can read them. You don't have to rely on Sitchin's translations or wait for academic books. You can go straight to the source. And when you do win, You read the actual Sumerian texts rather than interpretations filtered through ancient astronaut theory. Something interesting happens. The texts become stranger, not less strange. The Anunnaki remain mysterious. The antediluvian period remains inexplicable. The sudden appearance of Sumerian civilization remains puzzling. But you see the texts as the Sumerians wrote them, not as evidence for aliens, but as sophisticated theological and philosophical literature. From people grappling with the same questions we face. Where did we come from? Why do we exist? What is our relationship to forces greater than ourselves? Why does civilization feel like we're maintaining something rather than creating something new? The modern rediscovery of Sumerian texts has given us access to humanity's oldest written thoughts. We can read the Epic of Gilgamesh and recognize ourselves in a king's grief over his friend's death. We can read the Sumerian Job and hear questions about suffering that still lack answers. We can read about the flood and remember that catastrophe has always shaped human history. Whether the Anunnaki were real or symbolic doesn't change the texts. Power. These are human documents, people trying to make sense of their world, preserve their knowledge, communicate across generations. And they succeeded. Here we are, 5,000 years later, reading their words, thinking about their questions, wondering about their answers. The tablets have delivered their message. We're finally able to receive it clearly, without having to rely on interpretations filtered through centuries of misunderstanding. What we do with that message is up to us. The night grows late, your eyelids are heavy, the ancient world is calling you into dreams. Let the mysteries rest for now. The tablets aren't going anywhere. They've waited 5,000 years. They can wait until morning. Sleep and let your unconscious mind process everything we've explored. Tonight, the impossible rain lengths, the sophisticated astronomy, the divine councils making bureaucratic decisions, the flood that ended a world, the knowledge preserved in clay. Tomorrow, if you want, you can dig deeper, visit a museum, read translations, form your own conclusions about what the Anunnaki really were and whether the antediluvian age was real. But tonight, just rest. Let these ancient stories wash over you like the flood waters that once covered the earth. Let yourself drift into the space between waking and sleeping, where mythology and history blur together. The Sumerians are waiting there, in the deep places of human memory, in the ancestral knowledge we've almost forgotten, but never quite lost. They have more to tell us, more secrets, more warnings, more promises about cycles completing and ages turning. But that's for another night. For now, sleep, dream of clay tablets and cuneiform marks and hands pressing messages into wet earth 5,000 years ago, trusting that someday someone would read them and understand. You've heard their words tonight. You've traveled back to the very beginning of written history and glimpsed what the Sumerians wanted us to know. The Anunnaki walked the earth before the flood destroyed that world, and they promised or threatened to return. Are we ready? Will we recognize the signs? Have the cycles already begun to turn? The tablets can't tell us. They can only preserve the memory and trust that we're wise enough to understand when the time comes. Rest now. Let the ancient world fade into dreams. Let the mysteries remain mysterious just a little longer. The Anunnaki are patient. They've waited this long. They can wait while you sleep. And who knows, maybe in your dreams tonight you'll see them, walking through antediluvian cities beneath an alien sky, teaching the first humans how to build and plant and write, gathering in assembly to decide humanity's fate. Maybe you'll remember something we've all forgotten, some ancient knowledge buried deep in human consciousness, waiting for the right moment to resurface. Or maybe you'll just sleep deeply, peacefully, while these ancient stories settle into your mind like sediment settling in flood. Water slowly, quietly, becoming part of the foundation upon which everything else rests. Either way, sleep well. The tablets have delivered their message. And you, wherever you are, whatever time it is, have heard it. That alone might be enough, for now, for tonight. The rest can wait for morning, for another night, for the appointed time. When everything becomes clear. Sleep, dream, remember. The Anunnaki are waiting. And so are you. Let yourself drift now. Let the weight of 5,000 years settle over you like warm sand. Imagine you're lying on the roof of a Sumerian temple, the night sky spread above you, the same stars the ancient astronomers watched, the same constellations they tracked across their patient centuries. The air is cool, desert air carrying the scent of earth and distant water. Somewhere below in the temple archives, clay tablets rest in darkness. Thousands of them, each one pressed with marks that preserve memories older than pyramids, older than empires, older than almost anything still standing on earth. Those tablets have been patient. They waited in the ground for millennia. They waited while languages died and cities turned to dust. They waited while the Tigris and Euphrates changed their courses, while kingdoms rose and fell, while everything the Sumerians knew was forgotten and then slowly, carefully remembered again. They can wait a little longer. The secrets they hold about the Anunnaki, about the flood, about the world before the world we know, those secrets aren't going anywhere. They've been preserved this long. They'll keep until morning. Let your breathing slow. Feel your body getting heavy, sinking into comfort like a tablet sinking into soft clay, leaving its impression, becoming permanent, becoming part of the earth. The ancient astronomers are still watching. From whatever place the Anunnaki went to, from whatever realm lies beyond the stars we can see, they're watching. Not with judgment, not with anger, just watching, patient as the tablets, patient as the desert, patient as the slow turn of precessional cycles that measure time in units we can barely comprehend. You're part of that cycle now, part of the long human story that began in Mesopotamian mud and continues forward into whatever comes next. Rest, the tablets will still be there tomorrow. The mysteries will wait. The Anunnaki, whether gods or memories or something stranger, they've waited this long. They can wait while you sleep.